we please welcome Dr. Anthony Tubbs.
Right, so this will be one of those awkward moments when the introduction has nothing to do with the topic of the talk, and so, yeah. So again, so this is the first time I've spoken publicly in a format like this in about 2 years, and so I'm feeling both anxious and rusty. So my apologies for that as well. And so this larger project is. Well, it will eventually coalesce into a book form, and you know, as Michael mentioned, I'm now department chair, which means that my life is a lot worse than it used to be, and as a result, you know, so this becomes a place where I can kind of like fall back to and find some like ways to kind of engage my thinking on topics that aren't related to Italian politics, both modern and ancient, and departmental politics, both modern and ancient. So yeah, so without spending more time on that issue. So yeah, so I, you know, I mean, it's what people sometimes kind of say that they stumble onto topics, and in this case, it was literal. I was in Northwest Rajasthan in 2002, and was kind of visiting a couple of villages up there up in that region. And kind of wasn't paying attention, tripped on a curb and fell as I was walking into Bawadi. But this village was economically structured like most villages in the area, around kind of specialized craft production, and specifically this particular village focused on knot pile carpet production. And so this photograph, I took this photograph like there in that moment of this family working together on a knot pile carpet. But what really caught my attention about this, and it was one of these moments too where I felt like I was looking at something of enormous significance but couldn't really tell what it was. and so if I just looked at it and thought about it long enough, it would kind of begin to reveal itself to me. But you can't see her in this particular photograph, but there was an older woman, 18, 19 or so, I'm not really sure. And she was sitting on a chair at kind of on the opposite side of the loom, and she was singing. And it was like this kind of what was it like? Well, I'll show you in a few minutes, like something kind of akin to what it was like. And I asked my translator, I said, like, why the singing? And he's like, who cares? I'm like, no, I'm interested. Like, why is she singing? He's like, it's just what the women do. It's not a big deal. I'm like, no, actually, I'd really love to know. He said, well, they're just singing the rugs. I was like, damn, that sounds really interesting. And, you know, and then we kind of had to hustle off. And, but this phrase, this idea of singing rugs, like really stuck with me. And when I had a chance to kind of get back to the States and think about this in kind of a more quiet and controlled environment, began kind of seeing suggestions that this was a pretty widely situated phenomenon. So initially, like my first kind of like encounter with the first moment when I began to kind of sense that this was a larger phenomenon than just you know, a technical feature of rug production in Northwest India. Kind of came at the realization that whenever a woman is described working at a loom in Homer, she's always singing while she works. And so from Book 5 of the Odyssey, this particular episode involves Calypso, who's described by Odysseus. She's inside the cave with a sweet voice, singing with a sweet voice as she went up and down the loom and wove with a golden shuttle. And then from Book 10, the episode was Circe, which is repeated actually twice within this passage and repeated again later on in the same book. So they stood there in the forecourt of the goddess with the glorious hair and heard Circe inside singing in a sweet voice as she went up and down a great design on a loom. And then Poetic, who is observing this, then repeats this again. It's like very, very clear that he's associating, or the character is associating the singing with weaving. And a closer consideration of the original Greek also pretty clearly demonstrates that Poetic is not describing what he sees. He's describing what he hears. He knows that she's weaving because he can hear her singing. So, you know, the first question that I kind of had to grapple with back in the day was, you know, to wonder if Homer's weavers are doing something similar to these weavers that we're seeing in India, and like singing out patterns associated with the textiles that they were producing. And so again, like, you know, I kind of started thinking about this and looking around, and again, it was always sort of this latent interest. Again, like, I guess as an Etruscan archaeologist, I have plenty to do, but you know, thinking about this and like encountering, just like reading different texts and like encountering different opportunities to think about this particular phenomenon. And it's not just Homer. If you were to consider the Rig Vedas, you see this construction repeated very frequently throughout the Vedic texts. And so from Veda 10, the man, and the man in this case metaphorically is like the creator, stretches the warp and draws the weft. The man has it spread out upon the dome of the sky. These are the pegs that are fastened in place. They made the melodious songs into the shuttles for weaving. So again, now in this case, this is a text which has not really evolved very much, or at least most linguists would say the Rig Veda, their form is remarkably consistent over millennia of recitation before it's captured in textual form, and would place Rig Veda 10 potentially as early as the 3rd, maybe even as early as the 4th millennium BCE. So even like considerably earlier than the very earliest arguments for the formation of Homeric epic. Some later examples, and much more awesome and brutal, from Norse mythology, the Ballad of the Valkyries, where here we have a loom which is made of, this is just really, it's awesome. So the Valkyries will cross it in a crimson weft. A warp is made of human entrails. Human heads are used as weights. Just awesome. And then kind of tying it back together over here, you know, the heavens are stained with the blood of men as the Valkyries sing their song. Again, the correlation being the Valkyries weave this environment. And so, you know, here we're kind of straying into the realm of the idiomatic as well, that the idea of the performance or recitation of the narrative of warfare associated with these particular poems is both described as something which is woven while also sung. A recent example in Beowulf that I kind of stumbled across as well, where in the latter passages of Beowulf associated with Beowulf's funeral, and in a death dirge, a Geatish woman wove for Beowulf, her hair bound up, a sorrowful song. And again, the original Old English makes it clear that she is both performing a song and weaving the shroud associated with Beowulf's burial. Now, another metaphorical point here is, and I apologize if I'm like bouncing all over the place. This is a geographically and topically very diverse subject, so I'm sorry for moving across so many different chronologies, texts, and spaces, and feel free to stop me if I'm not making sense and make me back up and explain things. So this vessel was produced by the Cleophades painter, probably sometime in the very late 6th century or early 5th century BCE, in and around Athens. It was then exported out into Etruria, where it was originally recovered in Vulci, the Etruscan city of Vulci. And it is a representation of a rhapsode. And so the way a rhapsode would perform, so rhapsodes, they would perform Homeric epic. They would perform Homeric epic modularly. So a rhapsode would not perform the totality of the Iliad or the totality of the Odyssey, but rather sectional modular portions of the story. And I'll return to that in a little bit as well. But another, in this case, idiomatic link between this idea of the performance, like poetic and narrative performance and weaving, is embedded in the word rhapsode, from which we obviously get rhapsody, which is a compound from rhaptein odein, which means song weaver. What the rhapsode is the person performing the Homeric epic by virtue of weaving it for, in this case, his audience. So now this is one of these kind of points. So this is like one slide that's meant to capture an entire chapter of argumentation here. So I'm going to have to apologize for kind of collapsing this down here. And again, as I said, and as Michael said, I'm not a textile expert. I'm an Etruscan person, and so I need to rely on a lot of academic partnerships for people to really explain and clarify certain issues for me. And I'm not always very good at articulating the complexities and depths of what they can see in these questions. Linguists focusing on the question of reconstructing Proto-Indo-European. Oh, I'm sorry, let me explain first. Because again, if we look at Beowulf, we're looking at an Old English / Scandinavian tradition, which is obviously present there in the Norse ballads as well. We see it again in Homer. We, of course, see it in these Indic texts and the Vedic texts as well. Similar kinds of references are found not just in Old German, but also seem to be reflected in Hittite texts. I mean, we see it remarkably consistently across a huge geographic range. And one of the common points of connection is that there seems to be a phenomenon associated with language groups that are descended from Proto-Indo-European. So very, very briefly, Proto-Indo-European obviously no longer exists, no longer survives as a spoken language, but it does survive in fragments of languages spoken across a wide geographic range. Sometime between roughly the 5th century and 5th millennia and 4th millennium BCE. We don't know why, but populations that over here in the Caucasus between the Black Sea and Caspian Sea begin migrating out. There are some interesting new kind of archaeological surveys of the Black Sea that suggest significant climatic disruption in that area that might explain why they move out, but they do, they move out. They push as far west, as far east rather, as Western China, and their descendant population today are the Uyghurs. They push down, obviously, into the subcontinent of India, and then also west as well, down into Anatolia, the Greek or the Balkan Peninsula, down into Italy. They're over here in Italy by around 2000 BCE, and then also splitting off into the Celtic populations further to the west, and Germanic populations as well. So this population migration, which occurs over a long period of time, probably for multiple causal factors, means that languages spoken in Western China, languages spoken in northern India and all across Western Europe are descended from this original Proto-Indo-European. The reason why this is significant is because, well, first of all, Proto-Indo-European linguistic scholars would argue that commonalities in, not all, but many of these language groups allow us to reconstruct both concepts and certain words that are native to this population, or rather native to this original language. So, for example, the word for salmon is one that's shared across a wide range of Proto-Indo-European descendant languages, which again would make sense that these populations are probably exploiting salmon. The word for birch tree, birch is also another feature here as well. The word for sheep, the word for horse, and also the word for weaving, which appears to be tex, from which we get textile, technology, a number of other descendant terms as well. So there are other reasons, and there are some kind of glimpses of other points of evidence that do clearly suggest that this population before this migration has developed a robust technology of textile production. Again, there was just a few very, very minuscule scraps of surviving textiles associated with the Maikop culture in this area. And also this process of linguistic archaeology clearly indicates that words like shuttle, words like weft, words, again, sheep, fleece, and different words all associated with the features of this process are original to this language group. And what it probably means is that as these populations migrate out, they take with them not just the technology of domesticated horses. Like the reason why they're so successful is because they beat up on people because they're riding horses. And so as they do, they come down with a scary fury, and they manage to insert themselves into these native populations. And not all, the Etruscans managed to keep them off to the side, which is nice. But they also carry with them technological assumptions, narrative assumptions about who and what they are. And they take with them, we think, this textile technology. So in order to kind of dig down into this particular issue, the premise that I want to kind of start from today with that very kind of brief introduction to this particular topic is that these Indo-European weavers developed a tradition linking singing and weaving apparently as a mechanism for encoding information related to patterns in textiles as they produce them. As these populations migrate outward, they carry with them this technical tradition, which leaves these very faint residues in certain textual traditions that are descended from this migratory population. So that's kind of the operating thesis. Where are we now? So we are talking about textiles, which, as any archaeologist can tell you, or at least Mediterranean archaeologists, textiles almost never survive. And so we simply don't have the essential kind of original material to consider. And so something that hardly ever survives archaeologically, and what we're now interested in is what it sounds like when this fugitive, fugitive material that doesn't survive, what it sounds like when it's manufactured. So this should be easy. There's going to be tons of evidence for this, right? And obviously, not obviously, but I like to tell my students that that throughout human history, when we kind of come to the edge of our evidence, that's when mythology takes over, and we begin to kind of think about how to reconcile the absence of evidence to ourselves. And so, to turn to the mythological kind of record for a minute, this is a statue that is its sterile name is Acropolis 1358. It seems to be referred to by the Roman travel writer Pausanias. So Pausanias is a character who was very interested in providing a fulsome let's go guide, a foeders for his Roman folks in the 2nd century CE, and writes this incredibly useful description of Greek sanctuaries and what kind of artwork you see in those sanctuaries when you visit. So he's climbing the Acropolis, and as he comes through the Proto-Indo-European, he says, there also are set up Timotheus, son of Conon and Conon himself, Procne too, who's already made up her mind about the boy, and Etis as well, a group dedicated by Alcmenes. This makes people very excited when you might be able to connect an actual sculptor of this period to an actual statue. So the statue was recovered in 1836, just about over here, which again is approximately where Pausanias seems to be in his description. So we have an image of a woman and a young boy, and then we have Pausanias' characterization of it. But obviously the next question is how do we connect this image to what Pausanias is describing? So Pausanias calls the image Procne, or he calls an image Procne, and her son Etis. And here we have the woman and child who pushes against his mother's skirts. And Bruni Ridgway, who is like this kind of luminous giant of Greek sculpture, she showed me this when I was a freshman in college. And it was one of those things, and then she began telling me the story, which the story is horrible. But it's amazing. Like this little kid, he's like pushing up against his mother, like the way a kid does, like just both for comfort, for security, for safety, because he doesn't know what's about to happen, because bad things are about to happen to him. This is a story, or rather, this is a representation of an element of a story that is one of the worst features of Greek mythology. I often get kids who come up to me like, "I love Greek mythology," and I think like, are you a sociopath? Or like, what's the matter with you? It's horrible. And this is a great example of why it's so horrible. Now Sophocles, the playwright Sophocles, takes this particular mythology and uses it as the centerpiece for his play, which we think was probably produced at around 430 BCE. And there are good reasons to think, although not totally convincing, but good reasons to think that whoever patronizes Sophocles to compose this play wins a dramatic award somewhere within this approximate time frame, and that this statue is the commemoration of that victory. So the story, if you're not familiar with the story, let me just run through it because it's awesome. So Procne is the daughter of the Greek mythological king Pandion. Pandion has two daughters, Procne and Philomela. He owes Tereus is a king from Thrace. He owes Tereus a favor because Tereus has helped him in a war against the Pelasgians. And to secure Tereus' alliance, he promises his daughter, Procne, to Tereus in marriage. So Procne marries Tereus and sails off to live in Thrace, which she clearly does not like. She's not happy living in Thrace. But she quickly conceives and bears him a son. So from the perspective of aristocratic values, she's doing everything right. But she's lonely, and she doesn't like Thrace, and she wants to visit her sister. So Tereus refuses to allow her to go back to Athens, but his suggestion is, I'll go to Athens, and I'll bring your sister to you. How's that sound? She's like, fine. So he goes to Athens, and he convinces Pandion to loan him Philomela and to take her back to visit Procne. But on the voyage home, and we know most of this, of course, from a distorted Roman iteration of this, which is recorded in Ovid in the Metamorphoses. And there are earlier iterations of the story that are more cleanly representative of certain kind of key features of the narrative. But so what all the narratives clearly share is the fact that Tereus rapes Philomela on the journey back up to Thrace. Philomela then denounces him, and at least as recorded in Ovid, which again, very, very late and obviously kind of embroidered by Ovid, Philomela basically says, I'm going to rat you out. I'm going to tell my sister what you've done. So Tereus' response is to cut out her tongue, so commits this act of glossectomy. And Philomela is now reduced to voicelessness. She's mute. Now, again, the way Ovid tells the story clearly diverges from what Sophocles appears to be communicating in the surviving fragments of the play. But Philomela, who is now mute, then weaves a textile, which she then gives to Procne. Procne sees the textile and knows what Tereus has done. And so what she then does, the reason why she's made up her mind, that she's made up her mind to do is to murder her own son, who she then chops up and cooks into a stew, which she feeds to Tereus. Yeah, okay, so that's the story. It's awesome. It's not a Percy Jackson ratified story, but that's okay. So here, again, a late 6th century red figure vessel now in Munich, kind of showing Procne killing Edis, who clearly did nothing wrong. But anyway, the way Ovid wraps the story up is that after denouncing, obviously it's very Game of Thronesy if you're feeding your heirs to the murderous king. So Tereus then rises up to kill Procne and Philomela. They run away, and then they're transformed into birds, and that's how the story then ultimately ends, and why it's incorporated into Ovid's idea of metamorphoses. So the question, kind of at hand, is what does Philomela weave? Like, how does she communicate this very complex piece of information to Procne? And how, theoretically, would an Athenian audience of the later stages of the 5th century watching this play performed understand how it could do that? So the play is actually mentioned by Aristotle in the Poetics. He's not a fan of the play. He doesn't actually like it all that much, and he kind of trashes it in some other ways. And what he says about the play, so like a lot of folks focused on the Poetics think that this phrase "voice of the shuttle" is an actual quote from the play, and I don't really fully understand why they think that. But what Aristotle says is, that Sophocles uses the plot device of the voice of the shuttle for Philomela to communicate to Procne. So what then does this mean? Like how would we imagine that that a shuttle could have a voice, or how it would communicate a complex narrative like this? Another kind of cool feature of this as well is that within the story you have Philomela rather. Philomela, who is the author of her own narrative, that she's recording the events of the narrative in which she is a character. And we see this again in a really interesting kind of, I think, kind of over-neglected passage from the Iliad, Book 3 of the Iliad. I just published something in a weird little Italian journal called "Helen is the First Homer," because Helen, here in this passage, Iris came on Helen in her rooms, weaving a growing web, a dark red folding robe, working into the weft, the endless bloody struggles, stallion breaking Trojans and Argives, armed in bronze, had suffered all for her at the god of battle's hands. Helen is weaving the events of the Iliad, that like Philomela, she's weaving a textile that represents the events of the story in which she's a character. Now, our last little kind of superficial dive into aspects of Athenian drama of the 5th century is with Euripides' play Ion. So Euripides is a contemporary of Sophocles. They clearly hated each other, and Aristophanes makes fun of both of them in his plays. But in the play Ion, so the play Ion is, I think, a super boring play. I think it's not nearly as good as I'm sure Tereus was. But Ion involves the character Ion, who is the child, although he doesn't know it, of the Athenian princess Creusa. Creusa was in a sacred cave of Apollo, raped by Apollo, conceives Ion, but then Ion is then spirited away and becomes a priest at the temple of Apollo at Delphi. Later on, Creusa goes to visit. She's having trouble conceiving a child. She goes to Delphi to visit. And then the play is like sort of this play of recognition. That the whole kind of tension is around the process of Ion, of it being revealed to Ion that he is in fact the son of Creusa and Apollo. But the chorus, the chorus in the case of this particular surviving play consists of Athenian girls, and they are the retinue of Creusa. So these are members of an elite household, and they're acting like tourists. They're here from Athens. They're out in Delphi. They're looking around, and they're looking at the temple of Apollo at Delphi, and they're describing different things that they see while they're walking around the sacred precinct. And this is one of these rare instances where we have like an in-the-moment opportunity to hear a Greek audience perceiving Greek art. It was kind of a cool little moment, but in any event, what they say though. So they're looking up at the metapiece of this temple, and they say, "Is it he whose tale is recounted to me as I stand in my weaving, the warrior Iolaus who bears with the child of Zeus all his labors?" And so we clearly know that we're talking about the story of Heracles and the Lernaean Hydra, where Iolaus is the assistant to Heracles. But what the chorus indicates is that they hear the story while they are working at looms. And then later on, by lines 507, 508, the chorus once again says, "Neither in stories at the loom nor in common talk have I heard that the children of gods partake of happiness for mortals." So once again, we have this really interesting distinction, that there are stories at the loom which are distinct from common talk, as if there are different ways of telling stories, and something's different about the stories that are being told while standing at a loom. I'm sure you guys probably know this. So this particular metope is actually from the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, not from Delphi, but it's up there just as illustrative purposes. Okay, so the notion of storytelling as a feature of textile production is potentially indicated on an inscribed loom weight that comes from Este, Italy, maybe. So this population of the Veneto is well known for funerary behaviors, but not really otherwise well attested in terms of quotidian behaviors. Some recent excavation of domestic and votive contexts, like it basically says they're doing what most people do. They're living their lives and weaving textiles as they do. Inscriptions from the area point to a Venetic population, so they're speaking an Indo-European language, which is part of the larger network of Celtic languages throughout this particular area. So before getting into the inscription, there are some words of warning. I visited the museum in 2019, hoping to kind of get and take better photographs of this particular loom weight. And when I got there, the very nice folks couldn't find it, and that was a bummer. But one thing that we do know, which is well archaeologically attested, is that one of this quirky little customs of folks around this particular area is the production of these ornamental loom weights. They make a lot of these things, and so the idea of a loom weight, which is also inscribed, is not it's not outside the norm for the area. Now, unfortunately, there's only one published translation of this. I don't read Venetic, I don't read Venetic. And it's it's found here in this book, The Veneti, First Builders of the European Community. So this is, So the primary translations that are published in this book are the responsibility of Mate Bohr. So he was the translator and linguist for various elements of this particular book. Now, Harry Lemming, who is a very credible linguist, in his review, I love this, he called it an apocalypse, unfettered by the laws of historical grammar and relative chronology. And it's nice to see that Venetic linguists are as nice to each other as Etruscan archaeologists. So Lemming then continues to say that Bohr's various efforts at some translations are entertaining. He does ultimately admit toward the end of the review that while they are linguistically inaccurate in their specifics, they usually come reasonably close to Lemming's sense of their general sense. So what does it say? It's awesome. I so badly want this to be real, and I'm really worried that it's not, but it says, "Between the warps with speedy bobbins, or speedy shuttles, you weave and sing your songs of heroes." They're in Venetic. This really is one of those things where when I first came across this, I'm like, this is just too good to be true. It's not even possible. Who knows? It's hard to say. I have to hope that the entirety of this presentation's argument doesn't rest on the authenticity of this loom weight. And so the folks at the Este Museum did promise that if they could locate it, they would let me know. And if so, it might be possible to take a closer look at it to get a better sense of its potential authenticity. If Tomzik's revisions of Bohr's original translation are at least close to the sense of the text, we once again see this correlation between singing and weaving, specifically linked to the idea of songs of heroes, that there is a clear kind of narrative feature to this. So when we look at representations of women working at looms, so we have this example of a lekithos, which is now today in the Metropolitan in New York, or this great example, which is now in the Chiusi Archaeological Museum in central Italy. So this, of course, depiction of Telemachus taking his leave of Penelope while she's sitting at the loom as she makes the funeral shroud of her father-in-law, Laertes. There's a bit of debate as to whether we're looking here at an image of the production of the peplos of Athena. Some people would argue that it's the production of a peplos or a chiton associated with a marriage festival. We don't really know for sure, and it doesn't come with labels. But what both show is that if the production of textiles is associated with a phenomenon that links narrative form and singing as a way of encoding pattern-related information, then it's, well, okay, then we can kind of begin to make the, well, the argument, or the loose, let's say, gently posit for the moment, that the audial environment, this very fugitive phenomena, the audial environment of the production of textiles conceivably was animated by tonal rhythms and songs that conveyed pattern as textiles are being produced. And at least in some instances, those tonal songs can also convey or communicate narrative information. So when we consider the technological instruments used to produce textiles, and there are lots and lots of different ways of producing textiles, but within the larger kind of Mediterranean, your typical early loom will be a warp-weighted loom, so your weights are down over here. And your vertical threads are your warp, and your horizontal threads are your weft. So a simple tabby weave, which is what's depicted over here, just consists of jumping over or under prescribed numbers of warp threads to produce different kinds of patterns. The specific technique associated with this technology is called warp floating, a reference, of course, to the idea of the weft thread floating over the warp in prescribed patterns to create, or rather in prescribed intervals to create these various patterns. So we can sometimes, if we're lucky, hear the environment of traditional surviving textile production. And it kind of takes either stumbling on it in northwest India, or if you can sneak into places like Iran, you can sometimes see it there as well. Now, we can't necessarily reconstruct what a woman sounds like in the 9th or 8th century BC in Greece while she produces textiles, but this is what it sounds like today. So, as I mentioned, I first encountered this phenomenon in northwest India, but there are parts of the world where similar customs do survive. And so in southeastern Iran, there are vestiges of this tradition called Naqshikani, or pattern songs in Farsi. So these songs consist of repeated musical phrases that carry explicit lyric information that instructs weavers while they produce, in this case, knot pile carpets. And this is what it sounds like. Sorry, it's cut off. Okay, so we can't reconstruct. Oh, no, there we go. Sorry. We can't reconstruct or hear what Helen might have sounded like as she's working at her weaving of the Iliad. But we can make a few educated guesses as to what the poetic performance of the Iliad might have sounded like. So again, a rhapsode performing the Iliad, what would that have sounded like? So whether that's the initial argument between Achilles and Agamemnon, which can kind of exist modularly and be pulled out of the story, the near victories of the Trojans, or what, at least in my mind, is the saddest part of the story, which is the death of Hector. I mean, I'm from Massachusetts, and so Hector always feels like the Red Sox, and Achilles always feels like the Yankees. I'm not a fan at all of Achilles. He's an asshole. So all of these episodes are poetically constructed according to specific but flexible metrical rules that would, when performed, have sounded remarkably similar to the Naqshikani phenomenon, these discrete musical phrases that are conveying this information. And then, so that what the rhapsode then does is this sings out pattern. So these Iranian weavers are then singing out this pattern information while repeating these tonal points of emphasis. Okay, so what then would this have sounded like? Where are we time-wise? Okay, so I wrote this out because this is really, really critical. I really want you guys to know that I do not believe that the Iliad is a secret pattern code of some kind. That would make philologists very upset with me, more upset than they already are. Elements of it could potentially, like elements of the idea of its metrical structure, could potentially be linked to an ancestral process of textile production that encodes patterns through metrically and musically structured mnemonic devices. Okay, so what that means is this. The Iliad's metrical structure, now anybody who suffers through high school Shakespeare knows about meter. So, so the iambic pentameter structure of Shakespeare is a stress, unstress, iamb constructed across the totality in 5 beats. The metrical system of the Iliad is called dactylic hexameter. So a dactyl is a poetic foot that consists of a long vowel followed by 2 short vowels. Every line of the Iliad ends with a spondee, which is too long, or like too, but what would effectively be that elevation in pitch at the end of each line of the Iranian singers. So a lot of linguists, a lot of philologists are of the opinion that that spondee is the way you know, the way you hear that you've arrived at the end of your of a particular line. Now, when you sit, as I've been kind of signaling this now for a little while, if you sit long enough with poems like the Iliad and the Odyssey and just kind of read them and commune with them, you really do begin to appreciate their modular structure. The narrative is broken into these discrete elements, which is a feature of the poems that caught the attention of like the truly visionary philologist Milman Parry. Fascinating character. Poor kid from, I think, California somewhere. I think he grew up in California. But was just this incredibly gifted linguist and went to Harvard as a teenager, got tenure at Harvard as a professor at like the age of 26 or something insane, and then was like accidentally, maybe not, killed by his wife in a hotel room in Los Angeles in 1931 or something like that. But squeezed a lot of living into a very short number of years, because he was sent, not sent, it was recommended to him by his advisor, René Millet, the great kind of French metricist, to go look in Yugoslavia, or what was then the Northern Balkans. So Millet, in his consideration not just of Homer, but of a number of earlier epic traditions, saw common metrical structures in things like Vedic texts and Hittite texts, and of course in Homer as well. And that led Millet to argue, or to advance the theory that structures, how to say this, that specific prescribed metrical structures present across a number of poetic traditions were there because there was an earlier ancestral tradition of metrical structures that Millet argued would be connected to this Proto-Indo-European phenomenon. Now, Millet had heard, he was in Paris and he didn't actually go, but he sent Milman Parry to what now, it's not Yugoslavia anymore, what now today would be Serbia, because he'd heard that there were still people who performed epic poetry as oral performance, as mnemonically committed oral performance. So this is a very famous 19th century image of one of the great early guslars, Philipp Wisnik, I think, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that. Right, okay, so Parry then recognizes, like by studying this surviving form of oral poetic performance, that the narrative modularity of Homeric texts is a shared feature of, well, it is shared with guslar performance. Metrical sequences completed by prescribed epithets, another feature which is shared too. And so at the time, something which now today is just a generally accepted feature of consideration of Homer, it kind of hit Parry like a lightning bolt when he realized that there was no Homer, that Homer is not a person, that Homer is a tradition that assigns authorship to an invented character based on a long evolving tradition of oral storytelling, like metrically sequenced oral narratives. So this form of oral poetic performance that again still survives today, a very thin silver lining of Serbian nationalism, is they've gotten really into guslar performance, and so they're I think that's like the only good thing about Serbian nationalism. So the modern guslars today, use a single stringed instrument called a gusl, and that's what this is right here. And so this drawing a bow across the gusl creates this sort of monotone beat, which is the metrical skeleton, as it were, of the guslar's performance. And typically these are stories of failed marriages, stories of bloody battles, very much like Homer. Now, a Greek rhapsode, so going back to our Cleophades painter vessel, so what the Greek rhapsode takes his staff and bangs the staff on the ground to beat out this meter as well. Actually, in Bacchylides, for example. So Bacchylides, which ode? Bacchylides ode 56, something like that. Actually equates the staff of a rhapsode to the heddle of a loom. And saying that the heddle of the rhapsode is the staff that he uses. So again, none of these idiomatic connections to weaving. So we can't hear the tonality of a rhapsode as a rhapsode's performing because there are no rhapsodes of Homer left around. But the metrical structure of the poem is something a little bit like the performance's percussion. Yeah, okay. So again, I just want to reemphasize that I'm not saying that the Iliad is one of these things, but what happens if we graph the Iliad? What happens if we take this? What would happen if we took the entire metrical sequence of the Iliad and represented it as if it were a textile, to represent that like as if these are points over and under the warp of a loom? Now, initially, back in the early days of this, I'd get like graph paper, and I'd get like, I don't know, 3 lines through. I'm like, this is stupid. This is a waste of my time. Thankfully, the computerized world has caught up to us, and so it's a whole lot easier if we get a computer to do this for us. So in 2019, fall of 2019, I was teaching this like ridiculous class called Visualizing Archaeological Data that I'm not qualified to teach. But as I was stumbling through GIS applications and stumbling through other uses of fancy computers, the class was divided about equally between students from classics and archaeology and students from computational science and informatics. And it was really wonderful. It was an amazing kind of dialogue and conversation between these groups of kids as I kind of introduced them to this idea, saying like, would you guys want to do this? And of course, the comp sci people were like, yes. And the classicists were like, absolutely. So there's this crazy person who lives in Chicago. He's somehow connected to the University of Chicago, but I'm not quite sure how. But his singular joy in what I imagine is otherwise a very lonely life is he likes to establish the full scansion of ancient texts, and then he publishes them online. And that's great for him because we could grab it. And so we then download the entirety of the Iliad in CSV form, comma-separated value tables, which are just like Excel spreadsheets separated by these values, which then gives us the means to then construct Python code to then graph out what this then looks like. All right, so you're ready. So this then is the Iliad. It's not very exciting. This was a big bummer because I was expecting to see amazing things, and instead it was like looking, at a TV when I was 6, hoping to get a UHF channel. And so I would have these groups like put together sequential strings that I'll explain in a little bit as well, and I would just sit staring at these things, like hoping to see something, and it was definitely a Rorschach test. I was like, I think I can see. Like, no, it's not there. But that's because I had screwed up. Because again, I am not a specialist in any of this stuff, and one of the things that I'm not a specialist in is weaving. I'm not a weaver. And I made a whole bunch of mistakes. Number one, what I hadn't accounted for is the boustrophodon nature of weaving. That a weaving, like it's not like a typewriter. It doesn't go to the end and then whip back. It moves back and forth across this. And so this is a representation as if the Iliad is typed out. That's wrong. That's definitely wrong. So again, great course correction by a lot of the students I was working with, because one of whom happened to be a lifelong weaver. She was young, like short life, but her grandmother is Armenian, and she had practiced inkle weaving for her whole life. And so Adriana was like, well, you screwed up twice. Like, how do I do that? She's like, well, it goes back and forth. Like, right, of course it does. And then secondly, so Adriana also sort of said, well, okay, like you're interested in the question of what this system sounds like. So what if like that double long at the end of every line is an indication to jump above or below a warp thread? And so you'd hear the double long and not represent it as 2 points, but rather as 1 point. I'm like, okay, so then the coders like do their coding stuff. And this then is the next iteration of it. So this then is the Iliad, the totality of the Iliad, represented with these 2 new variables, with a boustrophodon representation of the text and the spondi, the concluding spondi of each line, represented as a single point rather than 1 point. All right, but now again, the Iliad is not a pattern code. That is not what it is, right? In part because the Iliad is an oral poem that evolves over a very long period of time. M.L. West over at Oxford thinks, people think West is a little bit crazy, but But he argues that there are parts of the Iliad that are potentially as early as the 17th century BCE. There are parts and fragments of it, or sort of surviving elements of that. And so you have an oral poetic tradition, which is potentially as much as 1,200 years old, before anybody tries to commit this text to commit the narrative to text, which probably happens in, well, almost certainly happens in Athens sometime toward the end of the 6th century BCE. Now, the earliest point at which we get an actual manuscript of the Iliad isn't until the 11th century CE, and so there's a lot of distortion there too. Moreover, a rhapsode doesn't care what this looks like graphically. A rhapsode can introduce all kinds of variation to the text. They can introduce enjambment and all kinds of metrical substitutions however they want to. So that's not really the problem. So the next question was, well, what would happen if we're not trying to worry about or think about what a rhapsode performing the Iliad might look like if it were translated into textile? But what would happen if you just took the metrical structure, just dactylic hexameter, and represented that with that strict sequence? And that forms this. So this is a graph then of dactylic hexameter when graphed at a point count of 775, which is to say there are 755 points along your axis. Because there's another variable, because this is stupidly complicated, there's another variable that I hadn't accounted for. So we can clean up the Iliad's text and represent these metrical sequences in this manner to show what a warp float would look like in this particular way. But we don't know another critical piece of information, which is how many warp threads would be represented here. So this is, again, the kind of the larger glory of using computers to figure this out. Unfortunately, when we're looking at these ancient representations, even very detailed ancient representations, we simply don't have enough information in relatively stylized representational form to make an educated guess as to point count or thread count. But we can ask the Python code to do it for us. And where are we? Are you going to work? Yeah, there we go. Okay. So this sequence shows the representation of pure dactylic hexameter at sequentially increasing point counts. And so if one were to set up a warp with 303 threads, you'll eventually kind of get to that particular point as well. So what we see, predictably, I mean, a mathematician could have figured this out long before me, but what we see, predictably, are 7 repeating variables as the positional shift of that critical spondy moves across different points of the register. And what we see is either a twill-like herringbone pattern, vertical columns at some even numbered intervals, and then the checkerboard pattern that presents at 3 of the 7 sequential point counts. So that checkerboard pattern, this one, represented over here, is the one that really caught my attention about this. Because if you're at all familiar with Greek geometric vase painting, there are a large number of vessels that depict textiles. So this is an example of a funerary crater, and it would be countersunk beneath an Athenian grave of the 8th century BCE. There's actually a little kind of colander-like holes in the bottom where you can pour libations down into the ground. And you know, it's in the Metropolitan today, and there are, again, many of these. And what we're looking at, because this is an instrument associated with funerary behaviors, we're looking at a scene of a funeral. And so we have the mourners, and we have some kind of heraldic scene up over here too. We don't know exactly what that is yet. But we have our mourners, and here's the bier with the deceased individual there lying on it. Individuals to either side lift the funeral shroud of this individual. So it's like a wake-like moment where the body is revealed to the mourners. Now, this style of vase painting is often described as horror vacui. This is just stupid. It's one of these things that, like, we should have never thought this was the case. But for a while, and as it was presented to me when I was an undergraduate, supposedly Greek vase painters of the 9th and 8th centuries BCE were really scared of empty spaces. So the horror vacui is the terror of empty space, and as a result, they pack all of this design information into a vessel. Well, this is idiotic. There's no reason to imagine that a vase painter would be scared of empty space. Instead, it was people like Elizabeth Barber and some textile specialists who, looking at this, were like, no, that's how you would produce a textile. Because the reason why is that you would not want your weft thread to jump over too large a number of warp threads because it creates the possibility of snagging. And so jamming all of this information together is a necessary feature of textile production, but obviously not something that a vase painter needs to be worried about. But of course, even in a relatively stylized form, as you can see, the shroud, as it's depicted, utilizes precisely the same pattern. There are a curious number of instances of the replication of this particular checkerboard pattern on a number of vessels that are related to funerary behaviors. So this is an example of in this case, a white ground lekythos. Now, so this is a white ground. This is a more traditional form of white ground lekythos. And you can see the lekythos standing here at the base of a funerary stele. And so we're very much in a cemetery, in this case of the 5th century BCE, as this woman is pouring unguents over the grave. And so there's a lekythos right over there. So again, this class of vessel is very closely associated with funerary behaviors. And a lot of examples of this type of vessel utilize this particular pattern, which with this like interesting sort of offset checkerboard or diamond pattern, which, well, this isn't just me talking. There are other people who've suggested that what we're looking at is some kind of architrave with a textile hanging from that architrave, potentially. All right, so as I was putting this talk together, I had one of these moments where I felt both really smart and really dumb at the same time. Because I've been utilizing that Cleophates painter image of the rhapsode for quite a long time. And every time I talk about rhapsodes, I show that particular image. And it never occurred to me to ask the question, like, what's on the other side of the vessel? But this is really cool. It's this guy. It's an owlus player. An owlus player who would be the musical accompaniment to the percussion and performance of the poem of the rhapsode, who's of course wearing a checkerboard vest. Now, I mean, it's one of these moments where like, this seems more significant than it probably is, but I just thought I'd throw it in because that was pretty cool. Anyway. Okay, so in dozens of examples of similar vessels that we see associated with 9th and 8th century Athenian burials that represent this prothesis scene, the scene of the laying out of the body at the event of the funeral, the same checkerboard pattern is represented over and over again, as you can see over here on the Dipulon amphora as well. But other geometric patterns commonly used to decorate pottery can also be produced by different positional shifts of that critical spondee. So a study, like a fairly early distributional study produced by folks who were also at the University of Chicago, took the entire text of the Iliad and discovered that the most common metrical variation found throughout the Iliad is when the first foot of that dactylic hexameter line is substituted with a spondee. And so you can have a long at the beginning of the line. And when you take that sequence of spondee, dactyl, 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 spondee, and graph it out, it produces this pattern. Other kinds of common positional substitutions that are found throughout the text can be used to produce a whole range of different kinds of patterns. It's a little bit hard to see here. I don't know if you can make it out or not, but this pattern over here is a close approximation of what you see represented there. And again, our zigzags are represented over here as well. So again, theoretically, and just theoretically, it is like not notionally possible to create different positional points of emphasis across these repeating phrases to produce a whole range of different predictable textile patterns. So to return to Philomela and Procne, like what does Philomela weave? What does Procne see? How does she interpret that? And then why can't Tereus understand any of it? Now again, the most intact iteration and version of the myth is in Ovid, which is very, very, very late. The play Tereus only survives in a few fragments, but from the Temple of Apollo at Thermon, dating to around 640 to 620 BCE, the sisters are depicted on one of the terracotta metopes of that particular temple. Now, most people think that probably they're in the process of butchering Edis, and that's probably what's happening here. So we lack a lot of information. Like we don't, the image doesn't tell us whether or not the textile is used to communicate this, and doesn't tell us anything about the question of the glossectomy as well. But if those earlier iterations of the story communicate or contain this kind of idea, we can at least probably exclude a couple of options about what it is that Philomela is weaving. And what I mean by that is this. So there aren't a lot of commentators on Tereus, but those who do speak about the play, most of them have suggested that what Philomela does is she weaves a text into her textile that Procne can read. But if this element of the poem is part of even these earlier iterations, it's virtually impossible to imagine that individuals in the middle of the 7th century BC in Greece are literate. And it's even less likely to imagine that women would be conceived of as literate within that environment. So it's highly unlikely that if the textile is used as this mechanism of communication between the sisters at an early iteration of the story, it's not textual. Which then also kind of brings us to the question, like, how would Tyrius not recognize that he's pictorially being depicted in this way? Which is, that remains a possibility, and I'm perfectly happy to imagine that too. But of course, these repeating metrical phrases, when shown in this graphic form, do at least allow the possibility that sisters who grow up within the same household producing textiles together may be privy to narrative forms that are represented geometrically rather than pictorially. So, just by way of conclusion, so this spring, when was this? It was in May. I like birding. I got really into birding a while back. I got really obsessed with augury and birding and stuff like that. And so I was tromping around the woods. I got bitten by a tick. And I got anaplasmosis, which is like super nasty. And so I had this crazy high fever. I was disoriented, weird mood swings. It was very, very strange. And my daughter, who's 15, like definitely took advantage of me. And I was sitting on the couch and just like wanting the world to stop. And I think I was watching something on Netflix. And she sat down and she's like, "Would you like to watch something with me?" And I'm like, "That sounds lovely." And of course, being 15, she started putting on like incomprehensible Japanese anime. And I was too sick to stop her. I couldn't. So, you know, so at that time, like our Netflix, you know, what do you call them? Preferences. You know, it was like one little preference thing where you can turn off. Apparently, I didn't know you could turn off. But when you get to the end of a show, like the next show just immediately starts again. And so I was in this like fevered haze as we were watching very strange Japanese anime. And so, you know, they were like 20 minutes long. And so, you know, it kind of goes through the title sequence and then the story happens and then goes to the title sequence, the story happens. And just sitting there in this like very, very hazy state, I'm like, oh, that's really cool. Because what was happening is that every time the show starts back up again, the theme music introduces both the general plot points and the characters associated with it. So like the Gilligan's Island. So Gilligan's Island, and I'm sure you guys all know this, right? You know, it goes all the way through here. The minnow will be lost. And then at this point, we then kind of, I didn't want to jam all the text onto this because then we have the introduction of the characters. And so we have, you know, Gilligan, the skipper to, you know, millionaire, his wife. And then in the early iterations, it's like, and the rest. They don't even like list the professor, which is a bummer, but regardless. So again, what you have there in this like goofy little song is what in the context of Greek drama would be called the hypothesis. It's the totality of the situation in which the characters are then going to be set, and then you also have the presentation of the characters. Thanks to Michael, last night we had a great bottle of wrath wine, which is drawn from this source as well. You know, sing of the wrath, immortal muse, Achilles' wrath, doomed and ruinous, that caused the Achaeans' loss on bitter loss and sent brave soul into the gloom, leaving so many dead men carrion for dogs and birds, and the will of Zeus was done. Begin it when the two men first contending broke with one another, the Lord Marshal Agamemnon, Atreus' son, and Prince Achilles. So this then is the hypothesis of the Iliad. And it occurred to me, again in this very fevered state, that modularity of the Iliad, if you're performing a part of the poem, what if this is like the Gilligan's Island theme song of the Iliad? And you would and if that were the case, it made me kind of wonder, like, is this a particularly old portion of the poem? And a very, hopefully, very consistent version of the poem. That, you know, if you're watching Cheers, you know, you can have different characters moving in and out of the actual play, right? The performance of the show, but the theme song's always the same. And maybe really appealing to that idea that potentially we were looking at a relatively old and relatively stable element of the poem. So I have my computer guys graph that out, and it produces this pattern over here. And so when we kind of like think about this question, like what if an Athenian audience for Sophocles' play there at the end of the 5th century BCE understood that the replication of a specific pattern could be visually recognized as an abstract representation of the narrative itself, as this is an abstract representation of that metrical form of the introduction of the Iliad. And if so, like, is this the underlying meaning of Aristotle's voice of the shuttle? Is this then what he's referring to? In Philomella's case, the shuttle's voice tells the story of the weaver through encoded potentially encoded information legible to other women capable of reading the text that resides within the textile. And of course, it's the voicelessness of Philomela that's also a very useful metaphor to think about the challenges of reconstructing ancient textile production in this form. When we think about ancient experiences of weavers, it's really quite staggering for an archaeologist to realize like how little we actually have and how little we actually know. But perhaps like through a considered and careful multidisciplinary approach that really reaches across these kinds of traditional academic boundaries, it's possible to marshal, not enough, but to begin the process of marshaling evidence to better understand this phenomenon and in turn better understand the role of women as custodians of both this technical and narrative tradition. So thank you all so much.
We certainly have time for questions, so jump in.
I would be delighted. Yeah.
You start with quotes from the Odyssey. And I'm wondering, I hate to give you another project.
There's so many, but go on.
But it seems to me, by the way, I studied the Iliad and the Odyssey with Cedric Whitman at Harvard way back when. And he was one of the early scholars to look for patterns.
Absolutely.
So it seems to me that the Odyssey, which comes later, and really weaving into its entire narrative, and in fact connects weaving with singing with deceit, would be also susceptible to what you're trying to show here.
Not being an expert in weaving, not being a philologist, not being a metricist. Right. I was limited to available evidence by this crazy person in Chicago who happened to upload the scansion of the Iliad and not the Odyssey. I absolutely agree with you. And so the next kind of phase of this is we're looking at Indic Meters and trying to better understand graphically the latent patterns within those Vedic texts. But we'll definitely return to the Odyssey as well. Yeah, so we're not ignoring the Odyssey by any stretch. It just happened, we just didn't have that kind of full set of information associated with its scansion. We would be delighted if there are people that were interested in providing that kind of expertise to us, which it sounds like maybe you might have.
Maybe that's a project for you.
I went off into the world of Latin. But
No.
There's another question. The confusion or the difficulty between rhapsodes and singers. Because the singer is inventing it and revising it with each presentation. And the rhapsode, as you said, has memorized it and is doing a performance of something already exists. It seems to me there'd be the original singers would have much greater variations in things.
Well, again, the performer of the poem is not worried about whether or not the rhythmic, tonal, or narrative structures are communicating pattern information. They don't care. They're performing for different audiences for entirely different reasons. So, I mean, clearly, like those women in southeastern Iran are bounded by the pattern that they are replicating by virtue of those mnemonic devices.
Wonderful.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah. And again, that's another dimension of this too. There's this wonderful ethnomusicologist based in Vienna, he's Iranian, and he has to hire teams of women to go into these spaces because he's not allowed to go back into these social spaces. But he has these teams of videographers who work for him who capture all of this. As an ethnomusicologist, he was really only interested in the fact that they were singing. But working with him has like completely opened up new doors for me in terms of how to visualize this larger project.
Well, I would agree, but thank you for this because
my pleasure.
To return to geometric design is to return to a lot of what Whitman started.
That's true. That's very true.
To see this attempt to unite the visual with the verbal is very exciting. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah.
I was extremely fascinated as well. I'm a medievalist, so every time I come to a talk on the ancient world, I kick myself about life choices. In my time period, so this is North Africa, 10th century. There's an interesting episode that I work on the 10th century Fatimid court, and There's an instance of, and I work on this eunuch who's the head of the textile, the imperial textile factory of the state. It's called the Tiraz, which is an Iranian Sasanian establishment of making wool textiles with, and in the Islamic tradition, it changes from imagery to actual inscriptions of text being written across as a band. So in the same way that you would see it on the pottery, you see it sort of in the weft of the textile itself. Now, in this 10th century biography that I read about, it's not the 10th century, it's actually a book of poems by a prince of this 10th century court. He's in the garden one day and he just sees this beautiful scenery, and all of a sudden he says, he sees flowers and then water flowing, and the verses come to his head. And automatically, instead of saying, okay, I'm going to write it down, because they don't have paper readily available in the 10th century at that time. So, and this is where my argument kind of went in the other direction, is that it's the lack of paper, and the writing process is like right now we think of it backwards, that okay, I just need to write it down and remember these verses right away. But if they don't have that available, what's the easiest thing for them to do? So he says, okay, I'm going to tell the people in the Royal Workshop to go ahead and start embroidering the poetry verses as I'm reading them off to them. So he reads them out, and then he instructs them to weave them into the fabric.
And are they described as embroidery, or is it?
So it's not embroidered. It's actually like the weft and the woof, but it's sort of as one textile terrazes. So they're not embroidered onto the textile. It's just it's one piece, but they do the designs, changing the thread to different colors as they go across the thing. So I don't think it's embroidered onto a
Right. That's really.
But are they weaving script? Or are they weaving patterns?
So that's where the talk kind of so the Arabic poetry is metrical, like it's on strict metrics throughout. What they're doing is and this is where I don't know it enough in detail, but there's a distinction of an S weave and a Z weave. So I don't know. This particular dynasty tends to.
That actually refers to the directionality of the spin of the yarn.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So which creates all kinds of different variation and pattern too. There's like other variables here too that.
Right. And so, anyways, so I was just like thinking is that with what you said in the 7th century of the lack of sort of literacy. Could this have just been, I mean, of course you didn't want to go in the direction of saying that, okay, these are just patterns kind of, or there's these hidden patterns within the text or whatever, but I mean, I wonder if that's just, if we take away the idea of writing things down, it just seems like the logical step for some sorts of communication.
I completely agree with you. And a modern analog are Pashtun weavers in northern Afghanistan. And so when would this have been? 2003, I guess. So during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, there was suddenly this new weird kind of rug that represented Soviet weapons, and they're called what are they called? Oxy rugs, picture rugs, and so they'll represent towns, and then you'll have like MiGs flying around, and you'll have they're awful. They're images of hand grenades and Kalashnikovs and all kinds of rifle that are all incorporated into these textiles. And there wasn't a ton of commentary about it, but people said, oh, well, maybe they're making souvenirs for Soviet invaders. But the Soviets were like, oh, we don't know what these things are. That's just what they're making now. It's really weird. And then in 2002, a new form popped up. And they were, we call them war on terror rugs. Like all of a sudden, like the iconography shifts from Soviet weaponry to American weaponry in some kind of weird ways. And there's one particular form of an upper border of these kind of rugs that consists of like a stylized American flag connected to a stylized Afghan flag with like shaking hands or a dove of peace. And then like weird phrases in English, like where is Osama? And it's like these kind of things that people are concerned about. And I was looking at these things, I'm like, what the hell is going on? This is like completely bizarre. And I had a friend in the State Department who I was talking to about this, and he's like, oh, I know what that is. And he showed me the propaganda leaflets that were being dropped out of American planes that have as a border an American flag and an Afghan flag and a little dove of peace connecting them, with all these like weird little phrases in English and Pashtun that are meant to encourage the population to point to where Osama bin Laden was. So I was like, okay, well that's great. And then I was in email communication with a guy whose aunt was responsible for making several of these. And so it was very complicated. I would like write him a question, and he would then take his time, go out to the village, ask her the question, come back, and then write me a response. And so it wasn't very effective communication. But my question was like, can you tell me more about how this happens? And her response, to kind of paraphrase it, was, well, they fall out of the sky. Okay. And then I figured out that it was propaganda leelas. And then the next question is like, well, how do you translate that into these woven patterns? And her response through this nephew was, well, you look at the picture, and you can make the picture into numbers, and the numbers you make into a song. Like, oh, okay. Like, and again, it's a way of just translating that visual image into these binary codes that are tagged with different, it's a pixelated form is really what it is, and the question then just becomes color variation as you move across that grid. So yes, I mean, in highly non-literate environments, people they maintain this tradition, which gives them the ability to replicate information in remarkably accurate ways that have nothing to do with literacy. Yeah, it's really very cool. Yeah.
So I was gonna say, just to bring you a little closer to home.
He means Italy, by the way.
The textiles from I'm going to say that let's say the Tomb of the Leopard in Tarquini, you get those grid pattern textiles. So there's I don't know if you spend any time, but there's lots of Etruscan textiles shown in Tarquinian tomb painting.
Sure.
And many of which mimic the same geometric patterns that you have on those vases from several hundred years before.
Right.
So it's sort of interesting that those patterns persist even across cultures.
Well,
and that but also these are Etruscans who are showing themselves as Greeks because they're reclining at banquets,
right.
and they have much of the same textiles. So somehow now you're getting the communication of textile patterns across cultures that may not necessarily speak with each other.
That's a distinct possibility. That obviously the trade in luxury textiles is an enormously significant but largely invisible facet of the ancient economy. And there's another facet of the technological economy that we often neglect. Like generally speaking, I'm not the first person to suggest this, but I think generally speaking, some of the most mobile members of ancient communities are nubile girls. And so they'll marry out into other communities and would conceivably kind of carry with them a whole range of different localized assumptions about technologies like domestic technologies and narrative experiences that they then bring into these new communities. And so it's entirely possible that these are Etruscans who are purchasing Greek-produced textiles. It could also be exchange of populations as well. And we wouldn't necessarily be able to tell the difference. But obviously there are Greek speakers living in Etruria, there are Phoenician speakers living in Etruria. And those kinds of polyglot environments are really the spaces where truly kind of dynamic cultural evolution can occur by virtue of that cross-cultural communication. Definitely. Yeah, that's very cool. Yeah. Tomb of the Hunter is a really good one for that too.
Yes.
With those animal friezes that you have there too.
Right.
That's right.
There's lots of those textiles in there, and it's I think it's the tomb of the funeral bed. He's at there's the guy.
Oh, it's the
bed. He's got the shroud over him, and it's that same.
It's the same pattern.
It's the same pattern.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you all very, very
All
much.
right, thanks.